we can start with the real program now. Dave Lewis. I've been following Dave for a couple of years. Everybody's on Twitter nowadays. I've been following him. And I always liked the wide horizon he has on many different things, on many aspects of security. New problems popping up, or the same problem coming back in new clothes. And he would cover this in a very interesting way, at least from my point of view. So when we started with the program, like exactly a year ago actually, so a year ago, we usually start in late autumn to prepare the new program. He was the first speaker we looked up for this program. And then when we focused on the focus theme that was a lot later, we asked him to present the keynote because we thought he's a person who will have a clear opinion on this and a certain oversight over this crowdsourcing phenomenon. And he was intrigued to tailor his talk to really meet our focus theme. If you're a regular attender here, keynote speakers tend to do their standard pitch. And Dave is different because he really adapts to our topic. And that, I think, is wonderful and great. Please welcome Dave Lewis from Cisco.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here at Swiss Cyberstorm, and I really appreciate the opportunity to see all these very blurry faces, because, wow, I can't see any of you right now, but probably a good thing. I am, originally, my talk was entitled Embrace the Hackers, and it's very much the theme of what I'm talking about, but I saw similarities between, of all things, sharks and hackers in the community, and I mean that very much in a positive sense, as opposed to what is typically a negative sense. One of the downsides of having a beard and this type of microphone is you may get some rustling, so I apologize in advance. So, I have been in security in one form or another now for 25 plus years. I have been a CISO, I've been a firewall admin, and all points in between. And along that way, I've learned a lot of lessons like wear Kevlar, if you want a friend, buy a dog, things to that effect. And I've also learned that I should put my Twitter handle at the beginning of the talk instead of the end, because then people complain that they didn't know how to get in touch with me. So I'll just put that there for now. I have done all these different things, and along the way, the really interesting thing that I did is that I kept track of everything I did by writing them down in notebooks. So before I ever got into this industry, I was working for a record company called MCA Records, and while I was there, my mentor at the time told me, write everything down. So for years, I carried notebooks with me. I now have a stack of them about this high in my office at home. And I'm able to go through them and learn from all the mistakes that I made, and I made a career out of mistakes. And that's a good thing, because there are lessons and opportunities that I learned to make things better. And by sharing these, I hope that folks can avoid the mistakes that I've made. Now, one of the things that I like to point out when I travel, especially internationally, is that I am a Canadian, because reasons. So much so that I even had to get a tattoo not too long ago with a Canadian maple leaf. To put that in perspective, I was in a hotel in India, and I was walking through the lobby, and this very well-dressed woman walks up to me, and she goes, "Excuse me, are you an American?" I said, "Well, no, I'm from Canada." She goes, "Good." I'm a little bit concerned as to what the response would have been if I had said anything to the contrary. So as a result, I realized that Americans like to put Canadian flags on their backpacks. I decided I had to put a Canadian maple leaf on my skin. Now, I've had the benefit of working at a lot of different places, been involved with a lot of different things. This is a sampling of things that I have done over the year, places I've been over the years. Currently, I work for Duo Security, which is now a business unit of Cisco, and this has been a really amazing opportunity for me because I get to be an individual contributor, doing research, giving talks like this, and sharing all these stories. But along the way, there were a lot of these organizations that I worked at where it wasn't always quite as enjoyable as all that. It was tedious at times in some of these organizations. And as somebody is breaking into the security profession, as a hacker, you really get delusional quickly, or frustrated very quickly. And that's an unfortunate thing, because you want to remain engaged. You are used to doing things in a non-linear fashion, used to thinking about things very, very differently. Unfortunately, a lot of corporate structures don't allow for that sort of thought process, and we tend to have to figure out how to get through, and as a result, we tend to get a little bit jaded, a little bit frustrated. Always got to work in the coffee break. So if we are a red teamer, if we are in compliance, if we're in audit, if we are infrastructure, all of us are defenders. That is the function of what we do. If you're breaking into a system, you are doing it to make that system better. If you are breaking into a system to ridicule someone or to make a name for yourself, you're doing it wrong. We have to make sure that we are there to do things better. Because have you ever seen that car that goes down the laneway and there's a dog chasing after it, trying very, very desperately to catch it? We as security practitioners are that dog, and we've managed to catch the bumper. Now that we have sunk our teeth in that bumper, we have to figure out what we are going to do with it, and we need to be the adults in the room. Unfortunately, we tend to get lost in the minutia of things that really aren't that important, like getting wrapped around things like the dark web, the deep dark web, the super dark web, or as I like to call it, the Vanta web, because, Vanta Black apparently is the new thing. Things like this, in the grand scheme of things, don't matter that much. We need to have a much more strategic view of things. And we'll be honest, as hackers, we don't typically think that way. We are usually looking at things in a very tactical approach. But we have to make sure that we are contributing in a positive way, because unfortunately people see something and they'll go, hey, you know what? This is really great to solve everything. While things like blockchain do have a place, it's not going to solve all the ills of the world. We need to make sure that we are handling the message, handling the narrative, or it's going to be done on our behalf, as we've seen in the media in recent years. So how did this all get started for me? There's a question I get asked a lot, is like, where did this begin? And I apologize to the cameraman, I wander a lot. Back in 1983, in a science class in school, there was a teacher there that had a computer. And he allowed me and my friend and I, to use it. And he taught us BASIC and things like that. And he was able to give us the opportunity that otherwise we didn't have. Because back then, we had cave paintings at home. We didn't have computers. So having that opportunity was really, really great. Of course, being the corrupt little miscreants that we were, we ended up duping video games and selling them to other kids in school. And all of a sudden, my road to becoming a hacker had begun. And this was really great, because of that opportunity, and that's just it. Young folks today need that opportunity, and they also need to have that hope to show that as part of a collective, they're going to be contributing something positive. So after that whole incident, a few months later, my dad brought home one of these, a compact, luggable computer. You've never seen a kid so excited to play with VisiCalc in all your life. I had too much fun with that. Unfortunately, this thing had no modem, and I wasn't able to dial up to anything, but I did have a great deal of fun with this, and I did learn a lot about how computers worked, which is really amazing going back and looking at that for what it was. And we learned, going through this, of how to do video games, things like that. We learned how to break things, not because of any sort of sense of malice, but because we had that innate curiosity. And then people would come out with different types of security controls, click, there we go, which would be there to protect their intellectual property or whatever it happens to be. And this was a great example in 2002 where this music producer came out with a CD that was copy protected. And it was very trivially broken with this. You could take a green marker, go around the edge of the CD, and then you could suddenly copy all of the data that was on it. And as hackers, we constantly have to be doing that to help, one, improve the security for healthcare systems, voting systems, financial systems, the well-being of us at large. And we have to make sure that we have a good grasp on that sort of messaging. Back in 1997, I started a website called LIQUIDMATRIX.org. Now, this was literally an aggregator for articles that I found, and I did this very much in a manual process using VI to write all of this, and apparently I had a death wish. And this was a way for sharing information. Now, back around 2000 or something like that, if I looked at the web stats of that page at that time, there were militaries, law enforcement organizations, governments from around the world that were reading this site regularly, which absolutely terrified me and enthralled me at the same time. Mainly because as I was growing up, I was not meant to be heard. I was part of a generation of kids that was, you were meant to be seen, not heard. Do your thing, but don't interrupt mommy and daddy when they're having their dinner or watching the soaps. That didn't work out so well in the long run because nowadays they can't shut me up, which is really ironic because I absolutely live in mortal fear of speaking in front of an audience. And yet I do it about 40 times a year. You learn to live off the adrenaline, I guess is the best way to put it. But as a result of all these opportunities I've had along the way, I've been able to do things like co-founding B-Sides Toronto. We just had our 7th year of this iteration, and we started 7 years ago with 50 people in a bar in Toronto. 50 people sharing ideas, learning how to do various security things, hacking, whatever it happened to be, in a safe environment. Because that's what we need. If it's a bug bounty program, if it's any sort of structure like that, we need some sort of safe environment which to operate on because there's a lot of broken notions as to what security people are. And if we have that understanding, if we have that community, such as we have here, we learn how to deal with the C-suite. Because the C-suite typically is a little bit panic-driven when it comes to cybersecurity issues. They tend to see it as a little bit of mysticism, and they're worried about all the sharks that are coming to get them. The problem is they're focusing on the wrong thing. What is the likelihood that you're going to be eaten by a shark versus drowned in the ocean? It's quite a skewed number, but the one thing that more people stay up worrying about is being eaten by a shark. It's really interesting. When we look back to the movie Jaws in the 70s, when it came out, we had entire groups of people going out in boats and hunting sharks because they were afraid of the threat that they posed. And this was really unfortunate because that didn't have to happen. So this is why it's very important where we as hackers have to do a better job of communicating. Because the world sees this very differently. So when we want to look at, say, oh, we must have tools, we must have books, we must have things like that, but not everyone is very much in agreement with that. So we have to be very cognizant of that when we're having these discussions, because the world sees us in a very different light. Now, having done security for as long as I have, one of the things that I learned very early on, that wearing a hoodie and big black leather gloves when you're typing on a computer is not feasible. I hate these images in stock images, and it just drives me nuts. Mind you, I have had to do that where I had to wear gloves because it was in a data center at 3 o'clock in the morning and I was freezing to death, but that's an entirely different story. So while the world sees us like that, the reality is we could be anyone. And we have to make sure that we are having that clear understanding that we are capable of having the discussion with senior management, capable of having the discussion amongst ourselves, so that we are getting the message across that we are ready to be part of the solution. Because there are deprecated notions of what we are. This happened to me in 2006. I ended up on the front page of this magazine, and I thought, at the time, I was both horrified and excited because I thought, okay, this is kind of cool. I never expected this. But my father's reaction to it was, and he was a CFO at a company at the time, he said, if you worked for me, I would have fired you on the spot. I went, great, Dad. Love it. Unfortunately here, he was part of an older generation that thought security should be not seen, not heard, just in the background. And he thought that by virtue of me talking about anything, that I was somehow negatively impacting security. And this is one of those things that really makes me crazy because that leaves us as security practitioners with a different view of the world in our own right. And sometimes this is compounded when we do things where we are hung up with what we found on Showdown, for an example. One of the things that seems to be a regular sport on the social media is people finding things on Showdown and then absolutely ridiculing and cutting down whoever it was that was a victim of this. Showdown is a great tool. It's a great resource. But using it to ridicule people and mock them is absolutely foolish because it makes us look like morons. We want to make sure that we are there for positive change. And that's the law of unintended consequences. We think that we're all cool because we're a hacker, we can do this, and look, we got a shell on your system. Yeah, but you basically used Google for hackers to find it. It wasn't that hard. We want to make sure that we are dealing with things in a cohesive fashion. We want to look at security vulnerabilities that we have known about for years and make sure that we are doing our part to address them and bring them to the consciousness so that things like this don't happen. For those of you who are not aware, this is WannaCry. This was using a vulnerability that was known for at least 10 years. It wasn't fixed. So we need to make sure that we are getting in front of C-suites, getting in front of the common people, getting in front of everyone, and getting that message across. We need to educate the folks. There's the beard again. But we know who we really are. But the problem is we need to be a little bit more honest with ourselves as to who we are, because the way we are on social media, the way we are in the public is not always how we actually are. And we need to embrace who we really are and be honest with ourselves before we can be honest with others. Because there is a lot of work to do. Data breaches keep happening, and they're not going to stop anytime soon. Back in 2012, I started tracking data breaches on my website because apparently I needed a hobby. So I tracked a whole bunch of these. At the time, one of the biggest ones, actually it was the biggest one at the time, was LinkedIn for 6.5 million records. That wouldn't even get a back page in a newspaper today. Nobody would care. 6.5 million records are like, eh. We have orders of magnitude of billions of records being compromised. So something is broken where we are having bigger and bigger data breaches. We as the hackers need to be doing a far better job of holding our own selves accountable, as well as the companies that we work for, to make sure that we are not getting deeper and deeper into this hole. How many people here are familiar with Amazon's S3 buckets? Cool. If you're not familiar, they are a data repository that you can spin up, that you can put image files or data files or whatever it happen to be, and by default, they are set to not being publicly available. They even say there, do not grant public access to these files. Unfortunately, a lot of the data breaches that we've seen in the last couple of years have been subject to things like this, where a system admin or whoever it happened to be had spun up an S3 bucket, created it publicly available, thinking, oh, nobody will ever guess this URL. GitHub is laden with tools that can help dissuade you of that notion. We want to make sure that we're not making it easier for the attackers. And for me, the attackers are hackers, but with a criminal intent. Because I very much see that as hacker is a term we need to take back. Because we have enough to deal with stuff like this. Trolls have now turned into big business. They are now being used to manipulate elections in various countries. I understand there's an election coming up here. In Canada, we have one coming up next week. This is a real problem for us as well. We have a lot of troll, a lot of disinformation campaigns that are going on. Even from the public parties in Canada, one of the public parties, who will remain nameless, put an ad out on Facebook that was actually completely false. They outright lied, and now they're defending that lie. This is the kind of thing we have to contend with. And why is this important to me? Because we live in a world where perception is 9/10 of reality. We need to make sure that we are championing that 1%. We need to make sure that we are getting the message across of what is real and what isn't. Because the world sees us as some sort of mystic beings when they watch media like TV shows like Scorpion or Mr. Robot. One of those shows is good, one of them is a travesty. But this helps color the perception of the public at large. And if we are not managing those expectations, managing that narrative, it's going to be managed for us. We want to make sure that the right people are doing the right jobs. Would you ever hire a baker to do your web security? Could you train a baker to do web security? Absolutely. Don't get me wrong on that front. But that would not be your first choice. Would you secure your voter database using surgeons? Nope. Would you use a philosopher to run your security practice, being a philosopher who's never defended anything in their lives other than their own reputation? We want to make sure that we are doing the right thing. Because things that we thought in 2012 were a joke turned out to be very real. This was from an article in 2012 where a hacker said that he had worked to help influence the outcome of the election in Mexico. At the time, a lot of people said, this is fiction, this couldn't possibly happen. Yeah, we woke up to that one rather quickly. Because when we're looking at things like elections and how they're handled, we want to make sure we're doing it right. Because democracy hinges on things like this. If we can't get this right, this is going to go horribly wrong. In Canada, as an example, we still have paper ballots. We do have scanning devices that I was brought to my attention are considered to be e-voting. I don't look at it quite the same way, but that's one of the problems is we don't have clarity around the definitions. And there will be some talks about that later today. They'll provide some great insight to that. But in Canada, even though we'll do the scanning, we still keep the paper ballots so that we make sure that we can audit. There are certain countries in the world where they don't have that function. I understand here you have the ability to mail in your ballot in this country. That seems a little bit prone to the ability to abuse it. Because hackers tend to look at things very differently. Very much like sharks, we serve a function. If we get rid of sharks, we are negatively impacting the ecosystem of the world. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. If we get rid of hackers, we're obviating the ability to help secure our systems. We're removing that completely. That's not a good thing. And unfortunately, we collectively get wrapped around the axle about threats. And we sit there and we think and think and think, and like, how are we going to deal with this? Until we end up in analysis paralysis, and somehow we got a boat but couldn't figure out how to get off the rock. But this is one of those things where if we keep worrying about things and not actually taking action to fix things, it's going to continue to get worse. And those orders of magnitude of billions of records are going to keep getting worse. Now, in the animal kingdom, if we look at sharks, they serve a very key function in that they help to keep the food supplies in check in the oceans. So you don't have overpopulation. You don't have things like that where species are dying out because there's just too many of them. They keep that balance. Hackers, conversely, are constantly working to find vulnerabilities and things like that to make sure that the networks and the systems are better secured. Because we want to make sure that we are doing that due diligence to protect our way of life. There we go. Sharks also apparently may held the ability to have various cures for diseases. One of the things I found very interesting about sharks when I was doing my research is that they do not typically get sick. It's very rare when you do see these sort of things. They have been relatively unchanged for a millennia as an animal. And we find that with these sort of things, where that they could possibly provide these functions, again, we look to hackers, and we look at hackers as the way they think. So many of the hackers that I know have come from non-standard backgrounds. I have a degree in archaeology. I used to work for a music company. I didn't really ever think I would end up at this point, let alone standing on this stage. And it's been a very weird journey. But as we've gone along, we've found ways to help better improve systems, better improve security by virtue of breaking things. Sharks also help to keep the carbon footprint of the world in motion so that as animals die and they rot and decay, they don't contribute to the carbon. The sharks come through and clean things up. Hackers are able to bring attention to all of the various vulnerabilities out there that really should be fixed. Not always listened to, cough, wanna cry, cough, but there are times where that is to be done. And we look at the way sharks can inspire, there we go, smart design. You'll see designs based on sharks in automotive, in motorcycles, in planes, in various types of, you name it. They can really have an impact. And by virtue of what we're doing, we're able to affect positive design choices. One really interesting thing, I used to work for a power company years ago where we had two sites that were using BGP to load balance where you were coming from. You would go to one site versus the other. On the face of it, that sounds like a really cool idea, but these two buildings were 20 kilometers apart. So it really didn't work out, especially when the entire population base was from pretty much Ontario that would have been using that website in Canada. So we ended up changing that in a way that we said, okay, if we were going to break this system, how would we break it? And we went and reverse engineered the whole thing. So we went, okay, this is what we would do here, here, and here, and this is how we would knock it over. So taking that in mind, we extrapolated it from there, and it's like, how can we build it out from here? And so we built it with one main system and a hot standby. We used VRRP and other things like that, so everything could fail over seamlessly. And that was just it. From those interesting things, we were able to take that design and improve it by looking at ways we could break it. Because we have to look at better ways to do security. How many people here have got their parents using PGP? Yeah, I didn't think so. Don't get me wrong. I love PGP, but it is not user-friendly to anyone who isn't an engineer. And my mother, bless her heart, is not an engineer. And this is the problem. We make tools that are not designed to be easily accessible. We want people to be better at security. We have to give them the tools to do so. We need to democratize security. As hackers, we have that ability to do that. The company where I work at, Duo Security, which is now part of Cisco, was founded by Doug Song and John Oberheide. Their whole driving purpose was to democratize security. Make it as easy as possible, and people will use it. And lo and behold, it works. When we look back at things like passwords, usernames and passwords, 1962 is the first real instance that we can find of passwords being used in a computer system. IBM had a system that came out roughly about the same time, but even they admit that the first system was from MIT. This was a system that was designed to manage high-end computing time for students, and the students could log in. They'd get 4 hours per week to do their examples and things like that. But other students figured out that they could iterate through the various user IDs and steal time from other students. As a compensating control, the professor at the time created this password function and implemented it, and here we are today in 2019, still suffering from the same issue. We can do better. There are things like this, WebAuthn, which is an open standard from W3C. I would suggest you go check it out. This is a better way to do multi-factor authentication, and it is an open standard. This is not a vendor pitch. An open standard. You can freely download it. We need to do a better job. And as hackers, we have to band together. Sometimes it'll fall into the auspices of something like a bug bounty program, an industry group, whatever it happens to be, but we need to work together and not go with the crab bucket mentality of trying to tear each other down. I've seen it too many times over the last 25 years. Somebody will find a security vulnerability in something, come out with the research, and they're ridiculed for it because they didn't do something that this other person thought was right, and then there's this war that develops. Or somebody does coordinated vulnerability disclosure, where everything's fixed before it goes live. People ridicule that. You're not going to satisfy everybody, but we want to make sure we're doing better for the larger audience, because bad things happen. In 2003, I was at a tennis match north of Toronto, and wasn't playing, don't get me wrong. I was watching this tennis match, and then all of a sudden the lights in the stadium went out. And luckily it was still about 4 p.m. in the afternoon. It was still light out, so nobody really thought too much about it until my cell phone rang. And it was my boss saying, "You got to get in here." And I was working at a power company, and he said, "We have a blackout." And I said, "Yeah, I can see that, but how bad?" And he goes, "It's bad." I said, "Toronto?" He said, "No, worse." I said, "Ontario?" He goes, "Keep going." I went, "I'll be in the car." So what should have been a 20-minute drive took about 2 hours because every light was out. Most of northeastern North America was out. And this wasn't because a hacker. This wasn't because something had gone horribly wrong other than a software failure. It was a simple software failure. Whether or not this would have been discovered through security testing remains to be seen. This is a question we'll never be able to truly answer. But I think we should have been afforded the ability to test things like that to avoid things like this. If this blackout had happened in 2003 in February, there would have been fatalities. So it's not just about getting shells on systems, it's about understanding the real-world implications. What does your company do? What does your government do? What does your organization do? What is the function that you're contributing to? Are you there for the betterment of humanity? Or are you there to get your name in headlines? Come on. There we go. So I mislabeled this slide. That should say my vulnerabilities, but I was a little bit sleepy this morning with 3 hours of sleep. Thank you, jet lag. These are some of the companies that I found vulnerabilities with back in the 2000s. The last time I did vulnerability research was in 2008. And I went through with all of these different companies, and I worked with them to help remedy the issues that I had discovered. Now, again, bear in mind, this was before bug bounties and things like that. And all of these companies were, to varying degrees, very receptive and understood. And for example, WebSense, I'll give them full props. They took the vulnerability that I gave them, and they fixed it and pushed out a fix in 2 hours. That was amazing. The Oracle one was less than 6 months, which again was amazing in of itself. But there's one company that's not on this list that I will not name that threatened me. They said that if I had gone forward with the vulnerability that I discovered in their software, that they would, and I quote, sue me into oblivion. And they inferred that they knew people. I have never been so upset in all my life. But I had no recourse at the time. I had no way to address it. But now what I will do is I'll have conversations like this with folks like yourselves to make you aware of the things that the way they used to be, and in some cases still exist today. But there's far more in place now to enable us to do things in a more cohesive fashion. Bug bounties, there's a talk right after mine that is going to be talking about dealing with this with Catherine Chapman. Bug bounties are a good idea when implemented correctly. They are not a be-all, end-all. They are not going to replace various functions in your organization. They're nice to have. I've worked in organizations where we did not have a bug bounty program, but we did have an outreach so that if a researcher found a vulnerability, they could come to us and we'd work with them. And this actually was very good because in one particular instance at this company that I used to be with, the researchers gave us props when they gave their talk at Black Hat and even told the audience that they should check us out because we were hiring. You want to curry favor as an organization with the hackers because there's no reason to have an adversarial relationship. The hackers are there to do their function, much as in the same vein as a shark in the ocean. There is a clear function. We are there to help improve things. And we have to understand that bad ideas will come along, but sometimes those bad ideas may seem crazy, but somebody stood in front of a room and pitched this idea for a movie. Now we have, 4 or 5 of them? Just because you have an idea doesn't mean it's a bad one. Don't cut yourself off at the knees. If you want to give a talk, if you want to write a paper, if you have a vulnerability you've discovered and you want to figure out how to go forward with it, talk to people in your community. Talk to organizations that can help you, because there is a better way to do it than what I had to deal with 10 plus years ago. As security practitioners, we need to own up to the responsibility that we are now one of the adults in the room. We look at medical field, we look at legal field and things to that effect. They have been doing their things for hundreds of years. They have clearly defined processes. We've been at this, 25 years? We are fairly immature, and we are getting to a point where people are starting to recognize us as part of the discussion that has to be had. We need to make sure that we don't miss this opportunity. We missed the opportunity to have a really clear conversation with DevOps in the beginning. Now we're chasing them down the street again. We need to own it. And organizations, enterprises, what have you, need to do a better job of engaging with the hackers at large. Because there is a benefit to be had, either on staff, part of a bug bounty program, whatever it happens to be. We need to have these conversations. We need to share this information. Otherwise, the attackers are going to win every time. If you legislate away the tools, you legislate away the ability to be a hacker, is that going to affect your adversary? Not in the slightest. We need to make sure that we are going beyond that, and we need to embrace the hackers. I would like to thank Swiss Cyberstorm for having me. I would like to thank everyone in attendance for putting up with me this morning, and it has been a lovely opportunity, and I hope you enjoy all the rest of your day here today.
We have chocolate for you, of course, but first you will likely to have to answer a few questions.
Absolutely.
I'm hiding this. The light is very strong, and we don't really see... Do we see any hands?
Lights are coming up.
Okay.
And you can ask anything. I'm not afraid.
Anybody? Raphael has one. Here in the front. He gets his mic.
Thanks, Steve. Amazing talk.
Thank you.
Getting to the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the notebooks you have, and you use these notebooks to learn or to make people learn from the failures, the mistakes that you did. And I think learning culture is a very important thing. But wouldn't you agree that learning culture only works if you do the mistakes by yourself? I mean, if you tell people like, I did all those mistakes, please avoid these mistakes, right? Because they are bad and so on. I think that cannot be the entire story, right?
Yes, everyone will make their mistakes, inevitable. But there are glaring ones that I've written about in articles I've written on Forbes and things like that, and Daily Swig, where I've made these mistakes that are avoidable. There are some where you run into the CIO's office, you're like, oh, I found this 0-day, and the CIO's like, and? If you can't articulate it in ways to them where they understand what the business risk is, what is going to be the monetary cost or the impact to the organization, they're not going to give you a seat at the table. So, yeah, it's very much about understanding the message and framing it accordingly.
But if somebody had told you about those mistakes that you did before you did them and said, hey, this is a pitfall you'll run into.
That would have been great. Unfortunately, I started at a point in my career where there was no university courses for information security. There was none of that. We had to basically fumble through the dark to figure it out ourselves.
Sure, but would you have believed what people had told you in that moment? I guess not. I guess
in certain elements, yes, I would have, had I had that opportunity. I had basically learned by doing, and yes, that has a benefit itself. But these days, unlike me, who used to hack into systems around the world, not a great way to do things. Then all of a sudden, legislation came out that would put me away for 384 years. Didn't like that idea. Now you have cloud implementation where you can create your own private networks where you can test things in safety. So that would be a lesson learned now, because I got in trouble once or twice. Not proud of it, but I was never breaking into systems for a negative event. I was just pure curiosity. Usually when usually when adversaries would attack me, I would return the favor.
Yeah, but you're a professional, right? So
I am now.
You are now, right. At the moment when you started, of course not, as everyone is in the beginning. But the question is, how can we make learning, efficient or effective for society? Because, as you know, we keep telling people to not reuse passwords, probably not to use passwords at all, and not to do all these, what we think, stupid mistakes. But still, even if we tell them, they don't learn. And the only way they learn is by letting them run into or crash into the accident.
Give them better tools, better understanding, so that they can make informed choices. Granted, you're going to get people that are going to make bad choices. I mean, I've made plenty, I understand that. But if we don't provide them that ability to have another choice, just saying no all the time, or this is a really bad idea, or here, I've got the flaming sword of justice, how do we get to the answer of no? That's not helping to push the narrative.
Sure. Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cool. Do we have an additional question, a final one? If that is not the case, we'll release you the coffee break soon. So next talks come out. Oh, thank you very much, Dave.
Dankeschön.
Applause.